To start by paying my respects to His Excellency, the Minister of Migration and Displacement, to pay my respects to the Chief of the Parliamentary Committee on Displaced, to the Chief of the JCMC, to all of our colleagues in the government, to the distinguished ambassadors and members of the diplomatic corps who have joined us today, most particularly to the heads of the United Nations agencies and to our NGO partners. What we would like to do in the next few moments is to share with you the main parameters and outline of the humanitarian response plan which the UN agencies and NGO partners have put together in support of the government's plan. Allow us to start by saluting the extraordinary efforts of the government as it's put together this most credible plan for humanitarian assistance. The international community sees its role as supporting the efforts of the government, and this is how we plan to do so. The first point that we would like to make is that the humanitarian crisis in Iraq is highly complex. It's very volatile, it is becoming protracted, and very unfortunately, it is expected to widen and worsen in the year ahead. As I think we all know, Iraq is facing three crises simultaneously: a security crisis, a fiscal crisis, and the humanitarian crisis. Any one of these on its own would be overwhelming. To face all three of these simultaneously is nearly paralyzing. This is why it is so important in 2016 that the international community engage with the government, help the government during this period in its history. As the Minister has already shared with us, depending upon the Mosul and Anbar military campaigns this year, the number of people who may be in trouble in Iraq could rise to as many as 12 to 13 million. There are at least 500,000 people right now in ISIL-controlled areas who are expected to try and flee, and there are hundreds of thousands of families who we know are likely to remain trapped in areas that are besieged. We expect that conditions in return areas will remain highly volatile. In some of the return areas where destruction has not been as severe in others, the return process will be much smoother. But we all have to face the fact that in a number of communities there has been widespread destruction. If you look at the situation in Ramadi, in Sinjar, to name just a few, we know that international engagement will be required to help people stand back up on their feet. We are also gravely concerned about the fact that there will be millions of Iraqis who are falling into destitution because they have opened up their homes and communities, and they have welcomed so many people to come and stay with them. The next slide shows the scope of the problem. You can see that there are 10 million Iraqis, that's nearly 1/3 of the population, who are estimated to be in need. The United Nations and the NGO partners we work with through this appeal are hoping to reach 7.3 million of the most vulnerable. You can see by the size of the circle where the majority of people are who require assistance. The next slide is a summary of the assessments. Every year as we go into preparing for the appeal, the international community, the UN agencies and the NGOs do a series of assessments to confirm what the conditions on the ground are. You can see what the results are. A staggering 8.5 million people are going to need health care. 8 million people are going to need protection. 6.6 million need water and sanitation. There are 3 million children who need education support, 2 million of whom are out of school. More than 2.4 million people are food insecure. 20% of all displaced families are living in critical shelter conditions. We notice that 8% of all displaced Iraqis are living in one of the 45 camps. The next slide salutes and recognizes the national effort that has been underway to address the humanitarian crisis. It's a truly impressive effort involving the federal government, the Kurdistan Regional government, and civil society. It's very important to note that the lion's share of the burden has been carried since 2014 by the government. The federal government has provided safety, it's provided health care, education, cash grants, food. The Kurdistan Regional government, where more than 1 million IDPs have fled for safety and where there are 250,000 Syrian refugees, has opened up its home. It's provided protection, safety, and extended social services to the people who need them. As His Excellency the Minister has already shared with us, the new plan for IDP relief, shelter, and stabilization is a very ambitious plan. It's a credible plan. We recognize that it will be difficult for the government in the year ahead because of declining oil prices to fully support it. Another reason why international engagement is so crucial. The next slide shows that despite working in one of the most difficult environments in the world, the humanitarian partners that are part of our operation have made an impact. We've reached millions of people in trouble. This slide summarizes many of the achievements in the past year. There have been 180 organizations that have reached, on average, 2 million people every single month. 1.5 million people are receiving monthly food assistance under the leadership of the World Food Program. More than 4 million people have received emergency kits as they're fleeing through a rapid response mechanism that is managed by UNICEF, supported by WFP, supported by the UN Population Fund. You can also see that millions of people have received assistance with water and sanitation. 350,000 people have received shelter assistance, most of that provided by UNHCR and its partners. 2,400 schools and learning spaces have been rehabilitated. More than 5 million children have received polio vaccinations under the leadership of the World Health Organization, and more than 130 health facilities have been established and are providing aid. We're proud of these achievements. The next slide, however, emphasizes the key point, which is that the needs in Iraq are far outstripping national capacities. This is why the international community is so important at this particular time. This next paragraph comes directly from the foreword to the appeal, which all of the members of the humanitarian country team came together to write. If you allow me to share with you. Humanitarian partners are committed in 2016 to upholding and defending humanitarian principles in the midst of conflict and violence. And we will do everything possible using the most efficient and effective modalities to reach 7.3 million people and contribute to international minimum standards of care, assistance, and protection. We're going to be doing this by providing emergency support packages which will be sequenced across first line, second line, and full cluster responses. The Humanitarian Response Plan has 5 strategic objectives. They have been adopted in full recognition of the limits of humanitarian assistance. As we have put together this year's Humanitarian Response Plan, we have been cognizant and honest with ourselves that we are constrained by financial constraints, by access constraints, and by capacity constraints. The next slide summarizes the 5 key objectives for the humanitarian operation. It's a principled and it's a pragmatic approach. What we're trying to do is to reach as many people as possible in need. We're trying to give options to families to live in dignity in Iraq so that they don't have to immigrate. We're trying to support the voluntary, safe, and dignified returns of populations. We're trying to bridge the critical gaps in the social protection floor that His Excellency the Minister described. We are also trying to help people who have been brutalized by violence to cope and recover from their trauma. The next slide shows that the Humanitarian Response Plan, which the UN and its partners have put together, is one of the most highly prioritized in the region. In October, we went through a costing exercise where we looked at all of the needs in Iraq and estimated how much it would cost to fulfill them. Price tag is $4.5 billion. That's how much it would cost. We recognized that we couldn't possibly secure that amount of money or deliver that amount of assistance. So we've prioritized what we're going to do. We are fully aware that the amount which we are requesting, it's $860 million, is not commensurate with the needs. There's an ethical gap between the international standards, the $4.5 billion, and the amount that we're requesting. It's important that we acknowledge that there is that ethical gap. What we have done as a humanitarian country team is to put together an honest appeal. This is not an inflated appeal done in the hopes that a portion of it will be funded. We're asking for the bare minimum. It's a pared-to-the-bone appeal. Therefore, we need all of the money that we're asking for. This is the minimum that's required to help the most vulnerable people in the country. And finally, allow us to summarize the amount we're requesting. The United Nations and the NGOs are asking for $860 million for 2016 to reach 7.3 million highly vulnerable Iraqis. You can see the breakdown through each of the clusters. 70 million for protection, 240 million for food, 83 million for health, 80 million for water and sanitation, 180 million for shelter, and so forth across all of these different sectors. Excellency, Mr. Minister, thank you for allowing us to be part of this operation. Allow us to salute your leadership. Allow us to thank all of the donors who have generously contributed, and also to salute the frontline partners who are working so hard to help the Iraqi people. Thank you.